In 1714, Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, was crowned King George I of Great Britain. It was an unlikely succession. He was 52nd in line to the throne, and, aged 54, the oldest person so far to inherit it, and he was German. But he did have the one thing in his favour that mattered. He was a Protestant. For George owed his crown to Parliament, which, under the Act of Settlement, had barred Catholics from succeeding to the throne. George I will be succeeded by his son and great-grandson, George II and George III. These three kings' relationships with Parliament would change decisively the way Britain was governed. Britain in the 18th century witnessed a major political development, the rise of a second parallel monarchy, the premiership. It was leaders of this new kind who created the first British Empire and the old monarchy which presided over the loss of it. The holders of this new position of Prime Minister, as it became known, increasingly took control of the running of the country from the king and began to establish the pattern of modern government we know today. When George I arrived in England in 1714, the English had, for the second time in less than 30 years, a foreign monarch. Indeed, George was much more foreign, since he was so unremittingly, resolutely German. He arrived with German ministers, German-speaking Turkish body servants, and a German mistress, and, above all, with a determination to protect the interests of his German principality of Hanover. Subsequently, he never learned more than a few words of broken English, and his interest remained essentially German too. In England, for the previous 30 years, the two political parties, the Whigs and the Tories, had alternated in power. The Tories were the traditional supporters of monarchy, the Whigs sought to restrict royal power. Broadly speaking, monarchs had tried to preserve their freedom of action by not aligning themselves fully with either party. But George I saw things very differently. Passionately interested in military affairs, he had fought alongside the English in the War of the Spanish Succession, and he blamed the Tories for the peace settlement which had given back France most of what she'd lost in the war. He distrusted the Tories even more for their flirtations with the exiled Catholic pretender James Edward Stuart, who claimed that he was the rightful heir to the throne. And George I lost no time in making his feelings known. The day after he landed in England, George held his first royal court here in the Queen's House at Greenwich. The king paraded his high regard for the notables of the Whig party, but he administered a very public snub to the Tory leader, allowing him to kiss his hands, but saying nothing in return to his speech of welcome. If George had anything to do with it, the sun, it was clear, would shine on the Whigs, whilst the Tories were destined for the wilderness. And George did have a lot to do with it. Royal influence helped win the Whigs a comfortable majority in the Commons that would last for nearly a century. The resulting long Whig domination has been hailed as the restoration of political stability. It could equally well be characterised as 6 decades of one-party rule, with all the problems of one-party rule that our own times have familiarised us with once more. For, with their Tory rivals out of the way, the Whigs fell to fighting amongst themselves, and this struggle became linked with another within the new German royal family. The Hanoverians, it's been cruelly said, like pigs, trample their young. Worst was the mutual loathing of fathers and eldest sons. At first sight, George's son and heir, George, Prince of Wales, was a much more attractive character than his father. He was married to a vivacious, intelligent wife, Caroline. He was as fond of public pomp and circumstance as his reclusive father detested it. He had displayed conspicuous bravery when, as a young German prince fighting alongside the English against the French, his horse had been killed under him in battle. He spoke voluble, if heavily accented, English, and he'd thoroughly familiarised himself with English affairs. Indeed, George played the English card shamelessly, proclaiming, rather unconvincingly, "I have not one drop of blood in my veins that is not English." Tensions between father and son came to a head in 1716, when the king, who'd been pining for Germany, returned to Hanover for a 6-month visit. Custom dictated that the prince should have been left as regent. Instead, an obscure precedent was dug out from the Middle Ages, and he was created guardian and lieutenant of the realm, with severely restricted powers. On the 25th of July, the Prince and Princess and their daughters moved to Hampton Court Palace here, where, with a short interval, they remained for the next 4 months. The Prince, despite the limitations on his powers, was the figurehead of government, and he and Caroline determined to exploit the fact for all that it was worth. Hampton Court Palace had lain unfinished and largely neglected since the death of William of Orange, but now it burst into life. As Prince George and Princess Caroline moved into these state apartments, which had been specially refurbished for them, and kept the kind of splendid, open court which England had not seen since the days of Charles II. George heard of his son's popularity with jealous rage, and, when he returned from Hanover, he entered, against all his instincts and preferences, into a public relations war with him. So, in the following summer of 1717, the king too took up residence here at Hampton Court, alongside the Prince and Princess. In uncomfortable proximity in the same building, the two adjacent but rival courts continued to maintain different styles. The King's studiously informal, the Waleses preserving something of the traditional formality of the English court, for which they needed grand state apartments, like the guard chamber here, designed for them by the brilliant architect Sir John Vanbrugh. But King George had his own genius with whom to strike back. George Frederick Handel. On the 17th of July, 1717, just before his departure for Hampton Court, the King bade farewell to the capital in fine style with a grand water party to and from Chelsea. Accompanying the royal party was a barge with a large band of 50 musicians who played the music that Handel had composed for the occasion. The king liked it so much that he had it played over 3 times, going and returning. And no wonder, for it was Handel's water music. Let the Prince of Wales try to beat that. The rift between the king and the prince produced two rival royal courts, the king's and the prince's. Those out of favour with the king gathered round the prince, and it was from the prince's faction of the Whig party that there emerged the man who would redefine the relationship between the king and his ministers, and in so doing create the role of Prime Minister itself. The rivalry between King George I and his son, George, Prince of Wales, came to a climax in 1717, when the king expelled the Prince of Wales from the royal residence at St James's Palace. The prince decamped to Leicester Square, where his house became a rival, opposing court. One of the leading followers of the Prince of Wales was the up-and-coming Whig politician, Robert Walpole. The son of a middling Norfolk squire, Walpole was a mountain of a man with a gigantic appetite for food and drink, sex, money, power, and work. He was shrewd, affable when it suited him, and he knew the price of everything and everybody. What he understood best of all, however, was the House of Commons, of which he was long the undisputed master. For such a man, opposition, even when it was sanctioned by the Prince of Wales, was of limited appeal. And in 1720, he brokered a general reconciliation of sorts between the king and the prince, and within the fractured Whig party itself. This mediation restored Walpole to the king's favour, but what propelled him to undisputed power was his handling of the great financial crisis known as the South Sea Bubble. Aptly named, as it signalled the arrival of the boom and bust economy. The South Sea Company had a valuable asset in the slave trade monopoly to South America. But in a frenzy of speculation, the value of its shares was talked up beyond all reason. Bribes were doled out too, to the king, his mistress, and his ministers. A lucky few made easy profits, but when the shares crashed, everybody lost, fortunes or reputations. Everybody, that is, apart from Walpole. With his usual good luck, he'd been out of favour when the final scam was launched, and so, for once in his life, appeared as whiter than white. He also used his financial skills to wind the crisis down, without provoking either a financial or a political meltdown. Walpole now emerged as first or Prime Minister, and he advertised the fact to the world. This is Houghton Hall, which Walpole built on the site of his modest ancestral home in North Norfolk. He moved with his usual purposeful expedition. Designs were commissioned in 1721, the year his premiership began, and 14 years later, the lavish building was complete. For the great man, as Walpole soon became known, nothing but the best would do. He built with the best materials. He employed the finest architects and designers, like William Kent, who was responsible for these opulently gilded interiors and furniture. And he embellished the house with what was then the biggest and the best collection of pictures in England. The result was perfection. According to one contemporary connoisseur, it was the greatest house in the world for its size, and a pattern for all great houses that may hereafter be built. But at first it seemed as though Walpole's monumental edifice to his own glory had been built rather prematurely. For, on the 22nd of June, 1727, George I died, fittingly on the way to stay in Hanover. At first his son refused to believe the news, fearing that it was a trick played by his father to entrap him into incautious expressions of joy. But when George II was persuaded of its truth, he made clear that he intended there would be a new world. He indulged his love of splendour by having a magnificent coronation with music by Handel, whose great anthem, Zadok the Priest, has been played at every subsequent coronation. And he told Walpole, whom he'd never forgiven for transferring his loyalties to his hated father, George I, to take his marching orders. But Walpole kept his head. He proved his usefulness by getting Parliament to vote George a bigger civil list or income than his father. And, above all, he'd kept his friendship with George's able wife, Caroline Green. Other politicians paid court to George's insipid mistress, but Walpole knew better. "I've got the right sow by the ear," he boasted ungallantly. Walpole's friendship with Caroline was real, but it was also a matter of mutual self-interest. He recognised her power over her less intelligent husband. She realised that he was the best man to manage Parliament on her husband's behalf. With her unflagging support, his premiership was secure once more. George and Caroline had an odd marital relationship. He snubbed her all the time. She refused to be put down and always bounced back. Nevertheless, when Caroline fell fatally ill in 1737, George was heartbroken and tearfully refused a deathbed injunction to remarry by exclaiming, "No, I'll have mistresses." Walpole's premiership survived even the loss of so powerful an ally as Caroline, but now his enemies were gathering strength. Most important was the group known as Cobham's Cubs, who gathered round Richard Temple, Viscount Cobham, soldier, statesman, and landscape gardener. This is Stowe in Buckinghamshire, the great landscape garden created by Cobham. Vistas, trees and water are punctuated by artfully sited temples, triumphal arches and columns to create an idyllic classical landscape. It's intended to delight the eye, but also to exercise the mind, for each feature is imbued with layers of political allegory and meaning. There used to be another, very different temple nearby, satirically entitled the Temple of Modern Virtue. It was built as a deliberate ruin, while the ugly, headless torso represented the great man, Walpole himself. For Cobham, the architect of Stowe believed Walpole had comprehensively betrayed Whig principles by stealing the Tories' clothes. The Whigs had been the great anti-court party, determined to keep the powers of the king within bounds. But Walpole discovered that the way to keep office was to cultivate the king's favour and then use the royal patronage of titles, jobs and straightforward bribes to control Parliament. Concerned primarily with foreign policy, the army and their native electorate of Hanover, George I and II were content to leave Walpole to direct domestic and financial affairs. Here he was remarkably successful, thanks to his adoption of another Tory policy, peace. For Walpole believed it was peace that nurtured a strong economy. But Cobham and his friends argued, on the contrary, that war with France was both Britain's destiny and the route to riches, and they were increasingly winning the argument. Faced with mounting opposition, in 1742, Walpole won what amounted to a vote of confidence, but by only 3 votes. The margin of victory was too small, and 3 weeks later he resigned. Within 3 years, deprived of the energizing effects of power, Walpole was dead. Walpole was the first, and still remains the longest-serving, British Prime Minister. He created the office, but it was William Pitt the Elder, the protégé of Walpole's great enemy, Lord Cobham, who would first realise the power of a minister to reshape the nation's destiny. William Pitt had first met Cobham in his 30s, when his dazzling parliamentary oratory against Walpole had immediately made him one of the leading cubs. He became a frequent visitor to the Temple of Friendship, where a circle of like-minded political friends met in the symbolic landscape created by their mentor, Lord Cobham. Pitt later sealed the connection by marrying Cobham's niece, Hester. Hester often acted as her husband's secretary. Even more importantly, she was his nurse, for Pitt was subject to swings of emotion, from elation to prostration, that was so extreme as sometimes almost to amount to madness. At their worst, Pitt's mood changes laid him low for months on end. At their best, they drove him to heights of oratory that convinced his hearers that he was the voice of destiny, Britain's destiny. And that national destiny, too, is prefigured here in the Temple of British Worthies at Stowe. Here is King Alfred, honoured as founder of the English Navy. Sir Francis Drake, who first sailed round the globe in an expedition of magnificent, insolent plundering of the riches of the Spanish Empire. Sir Walter Raleigh, Drake's younger contemporary, who first projected an English colonial empire in America. And finally, the Elizabethan merchant prince, Sir Thomas Gresham, who stabilised the coinage and founded the Royal Exchange. Pitt, himself the grandson of a merchant robber baron come empire builder, took these ideas and made them his own. The result can be boiled down to 3 axioms: that the proper field of British endeavour was worldwide and overseas, not continental and European; that the navy and not the army was the right instrument to advance British power, and that overseas trade was the means to the wealth and hence to the power of the British nation. All this was guaranteed to set Pitt on a collision course with George II, for the king regarded the army as his own peculiar pride and joy. He'd even, at the ripe age of almost 60, become the last British monarch to lead his troops personally into battle in a victory over the French. He was also as devoted to his native Hanover as his father, and, like him, regarded foreign policy as his personal prerogative. This was bad enough, but what made matters worse was the characteristically exalted violence of language with which Pitt distinguished his position from that of the king and his ministers. This great, this powerful, this formidable kingdom, he protested in the Commons, is considered only as a province to a despicable electorate. Such language was unforgivable, and George was a good hater with an excellent memory for slights. The result was that Pitt, in the mid-1740s, spent a decade in a kind of limbo. He was too dangerous to be left out of government, but was powerless within it through the royal veto. His public quarrel with the irascible King George II had left the brilliant but unpredictable minister William Pitt in the political shade for a decade. For a man of Pitt's abilities, this was hugely frustrating. But Pitt's moment came. The 7 Years' War, as it was to be known, broke out with France in 1756. And it began disastrously for Britain, with the loss of Minorca and the control of the Mediterranean. On his return, the commanding officer, Admiral Byng, was arrested, court-martialed, and condemned to death for dereliction of duty. Pitt deplored the death sentence, but even he was powerless against the tide of public opinion and the king's view that Byng was a coward. The admiral was shot on his own quarterdeck. William Pitt, the boldest politician in Britain, seized the moment of defeat. "I know," he said, "I can save this country, and no one else can." Both the people and the politicians believed him, and George was forced to appoint Pitt as Secretary of State with the direction of the war, albeit with a bad grace. Almost immediately, the tide of war began to turn. For Pitt was a new sort of minister who demanded, and got, a new sort of control over both policy and its detailed execution. There was a uniform, overarching strategy which combined continental and overseas war. But what was decisive in the wider struggle was the superior quality of the British Navy. With dominance of the seas, the whole world was now a stage for Pitt's great imperial drama. The war was fought across the globe in 4 principal theatres: Canada, the Caribbean, India and Africa, both on land and at sea. Everywhere, Britain was victorious, and the smashing of the French fleets in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean gave Britain what she often asserted but rarely held: absolute maritime supremacy. Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War was a triumph celebrated in stone by Pitt's patron here at Stowe. This is the obelisk erected in memory of General Wolfe, who had been killed at the moment of victory at Quebec. And here is the Temple of Concord and Victory, whose pediment celebrates an enthroned Britannia receiving tribute from the rest of the world. Pitt was not only uniquely successful militarily, he also exercised a new sort of power. He'd been called to office, he asserted, by his sovereign, which was conventional, and by the voice of the people, which was not. Pitt translated his war aims into bold and vivid language which had a resonance in the country beyond Parliament, and he used the newly developing popular press to marshal public opinion behind him, just as would another great populist war leader. Winston Churchill, who resembled Pitt in so many ways, called the 7 Years' War the First World War. When it began, Britain was only one of 4 leading European powers. When it ended, she was all-powerful, mistress of a world empire and ruler of the seas. But George wasn't there to see it, and Pitt wasn't in office either. The morning of the 25th of October, 1760, began like any other for King George II at Kensington Palace. The king rose early, drank his chocolate, and retired to relieve himself on his close stool or portable lavatory. But there, without a moment's warning or a day's illness, he died at about 7:30 a.m. The gruff 76-year-old was succeeded by his grandson, the fresh-faced George III, aged 22. The young King George III had been a late developer, sulky, idle, and apparently rather dim at first. He'd been transformed in his late teens by a sympathetic mentor into a paragon of hard work and self-discipline. Above all, unlike his two predecessors, he was English through and through by birth and inclination, and he embraced his duty as a patriotic British king. The clash with the great War Minister William Pitt, who saw himself as having something of a monopoly on patriotism, came within hours. In his accession speech, given at 6:30 p.m. on the day of his grandfather's death, the new king referred to the bloody war in which Britain was engaged. At Pitt's outraged insistence, this was toned down to expensive but just and necessary war in the published version. The row over adjectives showed that the minister and the king took a very different view of the war. Unwilling to compromise, it wasn't long before Pitt had resigned from government. With the departure of the great War Minister, peace was soon made with France, and, despite some concessions to French pride, it brought the 7 Years' War to a triumphant conclusion for Britain. With the French expelled from North America, Great Britain and King George III were masters of a global empire, but such a prize didn't come cheaply. The new empire needed protecting and administering. The cost of maintaining the American establishment alone had increased more than fourfold, and this burden fell on a British population of only 8 million. Why shouldn't British ministers naturally asked America bear its share of the burden? After all, the war, as Pitt had repeatedly stated, had been fought on America's behalf, and Americans had been its principal beneficiary, with the removal of the threat of the French in Canada and of the French allies amongst the Indian tribes. And there's no doubt that British America had deep pockets. Freed from the threat of war at home, the economies of the 13 colonies were rapidly expanding. Prosperous and fast-growing cities such as Philadelphia, New York and Boston had begun to rival their European counterparts. And they were only the urban centres of an overwhelmingly rural economy in which about 2 million people were thinly scattered over a 1,000-mile coastal strip, which is already 4 or 5 times the size of old England. The ruling class of this affluent land considered themselves fully the equals of their British cousins. They had the same rights and liberties, and they created similar institutions of self-government. This is the Capitol building in Williamsburg, the 18th century seat of the General Assembly of the Colony of Virginia. The colonial government here was the closest in structure to the Westminster Parliament, and, like Westminster, it was dominated by wealthy landowners such as Richard Henry Lee. Lee's ancestral home, Stratford Hall, is an American version of an English country house. And the Lees, their wealth derived from tobacco plantations cultivated by dozens of black slaves, lived a colonial version of the lives of the English country gentlemen who made up the great bulk of British MPs, and they displayed a similar self-confidence and sense of their own importance. The 12th of February 1765 was a quiet day in the House of Commons, with only a minor bill to tap American wealth by imposing stamp duty on American property transactions. As colonial business rarely aroused much interest, the bill was nodded through an almost empty chamber with minimal opposition. But the Stamp Act set America alight. For the British Parliament was not the only parliament in the British Empire. Indeed, here in America, there were 13 such assemblies, one for each colony. And each one of these assemblies, in its own little world, thought of itself as fully the equal of the Westminster Parliament. Thus it was, on the 30th of May, 1765, that the Virginian Assembly, with the Lees in the lead, passed the first resolution against the Stamp Act. This solemnly declared that the taxation of the people by themselves or by their chosen representatives was a distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, without which the ancient constitution could not exist. This was Whig language turned against the British Parliament, which had first invented it. Less decorously, as the date for the coming into operation of the Stamp Act approached, Richard Henry Lee organised a protest procession featuring his own slaves in costume and the mock hanging of the collector's stamp duties. Similar resolutions and protests, many of them violent, spread like wildfire across the colonies, and British America became ungovernable. The British made a final attempt at economic and military coercion. But instead of being cowed, the Americans in 1774 summoned the First Continental Congress here at the Carpenters' Hall in Philadelphia, with representatives from all 13 colonies to coordinate their efforts against the coercive British measures. In response to American resistance, King George III threw his weight behind the British Parliament, supporting its determination to impose its will on the rebellious colonies. Indeed, the king, now served by a weak prime minister, increasingly emerged as the figurehead of the struggle. Troops, including German regiments personally raised by the king, were dispatched, and in April 1775, the first armed clash, in which the colonials acquitted themselves surprisingly well against seasoned professional troops, took place near Boston at Lexington. The Americans took this as a declaration of war. Congress put the colonies into an immediate state of defense. They authorized a continental army of 20,000 men and appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. As the stage was set for war, George Washington began to prepare his army. It wouldn't be an easy task, but Congress couldn't have chosen a better leader. For Washington, though not a great general, was a great man. As Commander-in-Chief, Washington found himself in charge of a motley crew, badly armed, badly fed and clothed, and badly paid when they were paid at all. To keep them in the field required tact, occasional firmness, and infinite dogged patience. Washington had them all. He also had the natural leadership of a born and bred American gentleman. Washington was another product of the planter gentry of Virginia, where his family were neighbours of the Lees of Stratford Hall. As a landless younger son, a military career beckoned, and Washington became an officer in the Virginian militia. He played an honourable part in the 7 Years' War against the French, and tried, but failed, to get a commission in the British Army. Marriage to a rich widow and deaths in his own family now enabled him to acquire his own plantation at Mount Vernon here, where the mansion house, modest at first, was steadily enlarged and beautified over the years. But Despite his newfound wealth and status, Washington never lost his interest in military affairs, and when the Congress reconvened the following year, here in Philadelphia, he turned up in uniform, using his rank of colonel in the militia. The fighting had hardened positions, and in June 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia moved a resolution for independence. Thomas Jefferson, who came from the same Virginian landowning background as Lee, drafted the Declaration itself. Following on from his seminal pamphlet, The Summary View of the Rights of British America, the Declaration embodies Jefferson's belief in the Whig idea that all government depends on a social contract freely entered into by the people. The Declaration, with its ringing assertion that all men are born free and equal, became the Ark of the Covenant of the new Republic. Contemporaries were more interested in its violent and highly personal repudiation of allegiance to George III as a tyrant and unfit to be the ruler of a free people. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. King George III was now the focus for the Americans' anger. In New York City, crowds responded to the Declaration by tearing down the King's statue. But the immediate importance of the Declaration lay elsewhere, in its claim that, as independent and sovereign states, the United Colonies were entitled to contract whatever foreign alliances they pleased. And there's no doubt where their best hope of an ally lay, in their and Britain's old enemy, France. And French help was desperately needed, since, despite all Washington's efforts, the Americans barely hung on. New York and Charleston remained in British hands, and the most likely outcome seemed a stalemate. The deadlock was broken here at Yorktown, a few miles to the southeast of Williamsburg, where Lord Cornwallis, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in America, established his headquarters in 1781. Yorktown lies on a narrow peninsula between the estuaries of the James and the York rivers as they debouch into the mighty Chesapeake Bay. So long, therefore, as the British Navy retained control of the seas, Cornwallis was impregnable. However, the French fleet managed to secure a temporary but vital control of the bay. And, with the British Naval Relief Force too far away to be of any help, Yorktown was quickly surrounded and besieged from land and sea. Under heavy cannon fire for 20 days, Cornwallis's options began to run out. The result was that Cornwallis found himself caught between a strong French fleet which blockaded the James River and Washington's army, into which the French had also poured money and troops. Hopelessly outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, and beyond hope of rescue, Cornwallis sent his deputy to surrender to Washington. Here, in this field, on the 19th of October, with the whole British Army. "Oh my God, it's all over," the British Prime Minister wailed when the news of Yorktown arrived. It was, though it took George III some time to realize it. Faced with the humiliating and now inevitable loss of the rebellious American colonies, which were the better half of his dominions, King George III resolved to abdicate and to withdraw to his ancestral electorate of Hanover in Germany. He even went as far as drafting his abdication address.
His Majesty, with much sorrow, finds he can be of no further utility to his native country, which drives him to the painful step of quitting it forever. In consequence, His Majesty resigns the crown of Great Britain to his son and lawful successor, George, Prince of Wales, whose endeavours for the prosperity of the British Empire he hopes may prove more successful.
The king drafted and redrafted his abdication address, but never actually quite did the deed. In the newly independent America, there would be no king. Instead, the offices of head of state and chief minister, held in Britain by the monarch and prime minister, were combined in one person, the president. But it is the continuities that strike. In the new American capital, Washington, the monuments, lawns, and grand sweeping vistas are the lineal descendants of the landscape gardens of stone. Similarly, it is America today which embodies, for better and for worse, the Whig ideas of freedom, power, and empire which inspired William Pitt in the reign of George III, the king who lost America. Continental statesmen confidently predicted that Britain, shorn of her American colonies, would now shrivel to a second-rank power like Sweden or Denmark. But then statesmen often get things wrong.